Hello, my name is David Anson and I'm an autism campaigner, and I was kindly invited by my pod to do a short video on the link between autism and mental health. Before I go into any particular more detail, I think it's just important to note that autism is sometimes thought as a mental health condition, when in fact it's not. It's something called a neurodevelopmental condition, which is a different branch of conditions that is in the same family as things like ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and many others. And certainly, if you do want to find out more information on those particular conditions, I would advise you Google neurodevelopmental conditions or go to the National Autistic Society website, which has some very good information about both autism and its cousins, if you like, in the family of neurodevelopmental conditions. But of course, saying that, it doesn't mean that people who have autism, like other disabilities, are not susceptible because of other factors to develop mental health conditions. And if you look at the statistics specifically for autism, it's actually quite frightening. Autistica, an autism charity who also does research in this area, recently found out that if you're on the high functioning end of the spectrum, and I should say people on the high functioning end of the spectrum are just simply judged to have an IQ higher than 75, and if you're below 75 you're judged below functioning. But in this case, they looked at high functioning adults and found that high functioning adults were 9 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. And when they looked at teenagers and children, they found they were 28 times more likely to think or attempt suicide. In fact, when you look at it, suicide is the second biggest killer in the autism community after heart disease. And the average life expectancy for those on the spectrum varies, depending on what study you look at, between 37 and 54. So it is very evident that the autism community has a very significant issue around suicide, depression, anxiety, isolation, that simply isn't being addressed in the best way. I mean, if we look at some of the kind of the root causes that have been looked into in respect to this issue, they're multiple, and you couldn't pinpoint one, unfortunately, that deteriorates somebody's mental health on the spectrum. But if I were to run you through just some of the examples, you have things like sometimes people on the spectrum might have some difficulty communicating how they feel or expressing their emotions, which can make it difficult to almost tell people how they're feeling sometimes. You have those who are experiencing greater life events, and those on the spectrum who do suffer from more significant life events might be more sensitive to suffer from things like stress and feeling low, and especially if they don't have the right support systems around them, they are more vulnerable to be depressed and isolated and anxious. People who are on the spectrum regularly deal with things like rejection and difficulties integrating into society because of maybe the environments are quite overpowering or people don't understand them, they feel isolated. And I think we all know that if you're isolated, you are more likely to feel low, depressed, stressed, and that increases your factor of developing significant mental health complications and potentially feel suicidal. There, of course, is lack of appropriate support in society, and for the autism community, given the difficulties that we've had in the last 20 to 30 years to get recognition and specialist support, there just simply isn't enough of it, and a lot of people tend to find themselves in the wrong places, so when they're trying to deal with difficult situations, they don't always get that support, which makes them even more vulnerable because they don't get those issues dealt with appropriately. It's a well-known fact that those in the autism community have low employment rates. For example, the most recent surveys from the National Autistic Society confirm that only 16% of those on the autism spectrum are in full-time employment, and only 32% in the community are in part-time employment. In fact, it's among the lowest employment rates of all the disabilities. And the consequence of somebody who's struggling to get into work, who's struggling to get a claim and a stake in society, can have a devastating impact on their mental health, their well-being, their outlook on life, and make them feel more susceptible to feeling that they're not wanted or don't have a value. And if you feel that way, I imagine that would put you in a very difficult position. And if, again, people don't understand you, it's a compounding effect. Because people on the spectrum don't always get the right support, they might be suffering from poor physical health, which might make them more vulnerable to developing conditions or to not being able to look after themselves. And I think the one that a lot of people talk about as well, particularly for adults who discover that they might be on the spectrum later on, is a delay in getting diagnosis. It's not uncommon for people who think that they might be on the spectrum as an adult to wait upwards of a year to 2 years for a diagnosis. and they need help, and they tend to find that delay in diagnosis or the difficulties in fighting to get recognised for a diagnosis aggravates their mental health and sometimes makes them feel very hopeless, which it would do if you were fighting to get a physical condition or any other condition dealt with. I think, speaking about that, it's important to recognise that if we put ourselves in the same shoes as someone on the spectrum, where you have all the difficulties that you're faced, it's not that surprising that somebody would feel that nobody understands them, nobody is there to help them, or they might just feel that there's no hope in trying to deal with those issues sometimes. And that's the devastation of it all, really. And we've got, I think when we come to this conversation in mental health, it's a fantastic conversation that's happening, and we're learning so much about one another, we're able to talk about things that have been stigmatised for generations. But the impact it has in other communities that hasn't been talked about is equally of particular value. So I hope my contribution through this video is that we can just highlight the specific issues that are coming through the community, and talk about them, because one of the things that we need to understand is that if we can, a lot of the issues are quite interconnected, but if we can highlight and talk about them and talk about some of the root causes and get better support, better understanding as much as possible, we can genuinely give people opportunities and in some cases save lives. But we need to have that conversation, and we have to try and almost punch through the brick wall of stigma and face that head on. And I hope that has a helpful impact for people who are unjustly suffering and deserve an opportunity to be treated as human.